year was 1990, the air thick with the scent of exhaust and damp asphalt after a morning rain that had left the town's streets glistening like mirrors. It was the kind of small American town where nothing big ever seemed to happen, where the days blended into each other with a rhythm that felt safe, almost predictable. The rows of houses looked alike, each with its neat lawn and picket fence, as though they had all been copied from the same sketch. Kids played until the streetlights came on. Neighbors waved as if everyone's life was stitched together by routine. That morning, the yellow school bus pulled up to its usual stops, its tires hissing against wet pavement. The sound of laughter and chatter echoed inside as children climbed aboard, filling the seats with the restless energy only kids can carry. For them, it was just another school day, another ride down familiar streets. The driver, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a quiet face, barely spoke, except to remind the louder ones to keep their voices down. To the children, he was part of the background, as unnoticed as the hum of the engine. Yet he observed them with eyes that lingered longer than they should, storing details no one thought mattered. Each stop brought on new faces, backpacks slung over small shoulders, shoes leaving muddy prints on the bus floor. To anyone standing on the sidewalk, it was an ordinary scene. Kids waving goodbye to their parents, mothers calling out reminders about lunches or homework, the bus door shutting with a mechanical thud. But under the surface, little cracks had already begun to form. The town itself, for all its charm, was not untouched by hardship. Families whispered about lost jobs at the factory on the edge of town, about money that stretched thinner each month, about fathers who stayed longer at the bar than at the dinner table. Behind closed doors, there were arguments muffled by walls too thin, marriages strained by secrets, and children who carried unspoken burdens heavier than their school bags. The bus, in many ways, carried not just students, but the quiet weight of an entire community's struggles. Some of the children came from families that seemed perfect on the outside, their mothers in tidy dresses and fathers with polished shoes. But their perfection often hid colder truths. A girl with braids sat near the front, her face pale, always staring out the window, as if the world outside offered more comfort than anything waiting at home. A boy 2 rows behind her carried bruises he never explained, making jokes louder than anyone else just to cover the silence he feared would expose him. And then there were the popular ones, laughing in groups, already rehearsing the roles they thought life had written for them. The adults tied to these children were no less complicated. There was the teacher who had reported concerns about a student's sudden withdrawal, her words brushed aside as exaggeration. There was the wealthy businessman on the school board, who wielded his influence like a weapon, ensuring his family's name remained spotless while others whispered behind his back. There were parents who, in private, carried envy, resentment, or desperation, emotions they buried beneath smiles at PTA meetings. Power, money, and pride simmered quietly in this small town, though no one dared speak of it out loud. That morning, as the bus rumbled down the narrow country road, it seemed to belong to another world entirely, cut off from the hum of adult worries. But even there, in that cramped metal shell, there were subtle signs that things were not as simple as they looked. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel each time the laughter grew too loud. His jaw flexed, his eyes shifting briefly to the mirror, studying the children with a focus that was neither paternal nor casual. He was not angry, but something inside him was unsettled, a need he had carried for years, pressing down like a shadow. The road stretched ahead, damp and gray, lined by bare trees whose branches clawed at the sky. The morning sun fought to break through the clouds, its weak light casting a pale glow on the windshield. In the houses they passed, mothers washed dishes, fathers headed to work, and no one imagined that the bus they had watched pull away would never return. The ordinary rhythm of the town ticked on bells ringing in the distance, the postman making his rounds while an unseen fracture was forming that would split their lives into before and after. No one knew then that this bus would become the town's dark memory, buried not only beneath concrete but beneath decades of unanswered questions. The children inside, laughing, whispering, bickering over shared seats, had no way of knowing that they were about to vanish into a silence so complete it would haunt their families for generations. The driver glanced at them in the mirror one last time, his face calm, almost tender. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the faintest trace of something behind his expression. Not anger, not joy, but something colder, more determined, something that suggested this ordinary morning was not ordinary at all. The road narrowed, the sound of the engine growing louder against the quiet countryside. The bus seemed swallowed by the trees, a moving cage of innocence, oblivious to the darkness it was driving toward. What looked like routine was about to turn into tragedy. And for 35 years, the earth itself would hold the secret of what happened that morning. The first weeks after the bus disappeared had been filled with confusion, panic, and unanswered questions. But to understand how it came to that point, you have to step back into the weeks before. Beneath the quiet rhythm of the town, threads of resentment and desperation had already begun tightening like a noose. The school bus wasn't just a way to carry children, it was also the crossing point of people's lives, each carrying private storms that would eventually collide. The driver, Harold Pierce, had lived most of his life unseen, a man who blended into corners and left little impression. He was the type of man who was remembered more for his silence than for anything he ever said. To the children, he was the bus driver. To the parents, he was a fixture. One of those faces that seemed dependable because it was always there. But behind the stillness was a man who nursed decades of bitterness. Harold had grown up poor in that very town, one of 5 children crammed into a house that smelled of damp wood and sour milk. His father worked odd jobs, his mother cleaned houses, and Harold had spent his childhood watching classmates laugh at his torn clothes and scuffed shoes. He never forgot their faces, never forgot how the wealthy children looked at him with eyes that said he didn't belong. Now, years later, he drove their children to school every morning, and each time one of them laughed too loud or asked him why his shoes looked worn, the old shame stirred like embers under ash. On the surface, the town looked neighborly, but cracks were widening. The factory layoffs had left dozens of men restless, wandering into bars at midday, their tempers sharp at home. Wives carried the weight of unpaid bills while still trying to hold on to their reputations. Church pews were filled every Sunday, but the prayers were stitched with fear of losing homes, fear of losing control, fear of being seen as less. The children absorbed these fears in silence. They carried them into classrooms, onto playgrounds, and into the bus where those hidden lives brushed against each other every morning. Among the children, small dramas unfolded daily, the kind that seemed trivial to adults, but carried sharp edges in the minds of the young. A boy named Peter had grown obsessed with proving himself the leader of his peers, often mocking the quieter ones to draw attention away from the fact that his own father had lost his job and was now drinking himself into rages. A girl named Anna clung to her friends but kept secrets about bruises that spread along her arms, secrets her mother begged her never to tell. Another boy, Thomas, lived in the shadow of his wealthy father, whose grip on the school board gave him power he wielded like a weapon. Thomas was the type who looked untouchable in public but confessed, in whispered words to classmates, that he feared disappointing the man who measured love in achievements. Inside the bus, these stories tangled together. The laughter was edged with cruelty, the silences heavy with things no one dared speak. Harold, watching from his mirror, took in every detail. The girl who pressed her cheek against the glass, pretending not to hear the whispers. The boy who clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. The ones who mocked others just to keep themselves from being targeted. To Harold, it was as though the bus was a stage, each child playing out the roles their parents had handed them. He saw their pain, their fears, and in his mind, it blurred with his own childhood wounds. But it wasn't only the children who carried secrets. Their parents, the so-called pillars of the community, were bound together by rivalries and grudges. One mother despised another for her spotless house and expensive clothes, while quietly drowning in debt. A father had once cheated on his wife with a woman down the street, and though years had passed, the memory lingered like a ghost, shaping every argument. The wealthiest man in town, Mr. Plank's in-to-face. Callahan used his influence to bend the rules, ensuring his business thrived even as others collapsed. His son rode the bus each morning, a reminder of Callahan's reach. And though Harold smiled when the boy stepped aboard, something in him curdled each time. Callahan had been one of the men who humiliated Harold's father decades earlier. Now, his son sat 3 rows back, laughing, his privilege obvious in the shine of his shoes. Tension seeped into small encounters. At the grocery store, Harold overheard 2 men laughing about the bus driver who barely scraped by. At the bar, whispers of money lost in the layoffs twisted into resentment. In the school hallways, teachers noticed students acting out more than usual. The whole town felt on edge, as though everyone was bracing for something they couldn't name. For Harold, that edge was sharper each day. He began to drive slower, letting the bus idle longer than needed at stops, watching the children more closely. Parents started noticing his eyes, how they lingered too long. A teacher once mentioned that Harold seemed off, but the comment was brushed aside. He was just the bus driver, dependable, harmless, invisible. That was the very thing that allowed his obsession to grow unchecked. The children sensed it too, though they couldn't put words to it. Anna once whispered to her friend that she didn't like the way Harold looked at her in the mirror. Thomas bragged that he could probably get Harold fired if he told his father he didn't feel safe. But none of them spoke directly to an adult. Children were taught to respect adults, to obey, and the town itself thrived on silence. People minded their own business, even when that business was dangerous. At home, Harold's own life was unraveling. He lived alone in a small house that smelled of mildew, filled with old newspapers stacked in corners and dishes crusted with food he hadn't bothered to clean. Nights were long and quiet, the kind of silence that pressed too hard on the chest. He thought about the children, about the town that never accepted him, about the way the wealthy still walked, as if the world belonged to them. His loneliness became a hunger, twisting into something darker. He convinced himself he understood the children better than their own parents, that he could give them something no one else could, freedom from the cruelties of their lives. At the same time, the town was boiling in its own problems. Rumors of an affair between a school board member and a teacher created tension that spilled into staff meetings. Families quarreled over money, over lost pride, over shame. People who had known each other for decades suddenly looked at one another with suspicion. The pressure wasn't just financial, it was emotional, social, spiritual. Everyone wanted to keep their reputations intact, but behind closed doors they were falling apart. The closer it drew to spring, the heavier the air became. Small arguments between children on the bus turned into fights, their cries echoing inside the metal walls. Harold never raised his voice, but his silence during these moments felt colder than anger. His eyes would narrow, his hands gripping the wheel as though he was holding himself back from something he couldn't yet act on. One evening, after a particularly long day, he parked the bus in the empty lot and sat inside long after the engine cooled. He closed his eyes and listened to the faint echoes of laughter that still lingered in his head. He thought about his father's humiliation, about the boys who mocked him as a child, about the way no one cared until it was too late. He imagined a different kind of ending, one where the town would finally remember him, where his name would no longer be small. The tension wasn't a sudden explosion. It built slowly, day after day, in every whispered insult, every ignored warning, every unspoken truth. By the time spring storms rolled in, the town was a powder keg. And Harold, quiet Harold, sat with the matches in his hands. The morning of the crime began like so many others, gray and heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The bus engine coughed to life in the chill air, and Harold Pierce sat behind the wheel, staring at his reflection in the glass before the first child climbed aboard. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, though he told himself it was nothing more than the cold. But deep inside, the decision had already been made. The thought had burrowed in, shaping itself into a plan so fixed that no amount of doubt could break it. He told himself it wasn't cruelty, it wasn't madness, it was justice. In his mind, he was about to do something that would finally make the town pay attention to him, something that would carve his name into their memory forever. One by one, the children filed in, dripping rainwater onto the rubber floor, their laughter and small arguments echoing through the bus. Anna slid into her usual seat near the front, pressing her forehead to the window. Thomas and his group jostled for the back, already teasing Peter for the hole in his jacket. Their voices rose and fell in a rhythm Harold knew by heart. Today, however, every sound seemed sharper, every giggle like a needle against his skin. The windshield wipers dragged across the glass, groaning, as the countryside blurred into a smear of gray. Harold drove the bus along the familiar route, but today he took a turn that was not on the schedule. At first, the children didn't notice. They were too busy swapping snacks, pulling at each other's backpacks, shouting over nothing. But when the bus veered onto a narrower road, lined with tall trees that seemed to swallow the light, Anna lifted her head. She glanced around, unease tightening her chest. Thomas called out, demanding to know where they were going. Harold said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the wheel as though it were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. The children began to sense something was wrong. Voices grew quieter, questions sharper. "Why are we going this way? This isn't the route." "Mr. Pierce, you missed the turn." Still, no answer. The only reply was the low growl of the engine, the steady pounding of rain beginning on the roof. Inside the bus, the air thickened with fear. Anna's hands trembled as she clutched her backpack to her chest. Peter, trying to mask his terror, joked nervously, but his voice cracked halfway through the words. Thomas stood in the aisle, defiant, until the bus jolted hard to the right, throwing him against the seats. The laughter and chatter had died completely. Harold guided the bus down a dirt road that wound deeper into the woods, mud splashing up onto the sides, the trees closing in like bars of a cage. His mind was no longer quiet. Memories roared inside him. He saw the faces of his classmates when he was a boy, the smirks of men who mocked his father, the pitying glances of women who thought they were above him. In those moments, the children behind him blurred with those ghosts. They were not innocent anymore, not in his eyes. They were the heirs of the same cruelty, the same arrogance, and he told himself he was saving them from becoming like their parents. The rain grew heavier, pounding against the metal roof, drowning out the children's cries. Some screamed, some begged, some pressed their faces against the glass, as if looking for escape. Harold's heart thundered in his chest, but his expression remained fixed, unreadable. He no longer saw them as children. He saw them as proof. Proof that the world had never cared for him. Proof that even the smallest lives in this town would grow to mock him just as their parents had. When the bus finally stopped, it was in a clearing where the earth had been disturbed, an unfinished construction site for the new highway that would soon cut through the woods. The ground was soft, dug deep in some parts. Machines left behind under tarps, their shadows looming in the rain. The children were screaming now, a chorus of terror. Some pounded on the windows, others clung to each other. Thomas shouted at Harold, his voice breaking between rage and fear, insisting that his father would come for him. But Harold wasn't listening anymore. His breathing was shallow, his vision tunneled. He reached beneath the driver's seat and pulled out the heavy chain he had hidden days before. The clinking sound silenced the children for a moment, shock rippling through them. Anna whispered, "Please, don't," her voice shaking. Peter sobbed openly now, no longer trying to be brave. Harold rose slowly, the chain heavy in his hands, his footsteps echoing down the aisle. The bus seemed to shrink. Every sound magnified the rain hammering above, the children's sobs, the creak of his boots against the floor. He locked the door behind him, sealing them all inside. His face was pale, eyes glassy. And in that moment, he was no longer just Harold Pierce, the bus driver. He was every wound he had ever carried, every humiliation he had swallowed, every night spent alone with his bitterness. The crime unfolded in suffocating silence, broken only by screams. Panic exploded as children tried to push past him, tried to pry open windows, tried to force the emergency exit. But Harold was prepared. He moved with a strange calm, his strength fueled by something deeper than rage. He wrestled them back, one by one, his voice low, murmuring words they couldn't even understand. Words about freedom, about how he was saving them, about how the town would never hurt him again. His delusion wrapped around him like armor, shielding him from the horror of what he was doing. The bus shook with chaos, hands slamming against glass, feet pounding against the floor, cries that grew hoarse. Harold forced them back into their seats, his chain rattling like a warning bell. The children, terrified and helpless, fell into silence, realizing they could not overpower him. Tears streaked their faces, their small shoulders heaving with sobs. Anna prayed in whispers, clutching her knees. Thomas stared at Harold with pure hatred, his jaw trembling. Even Peter, who had always joked his way through fear, was curled against the window, his face hidden. And then Harold did the unthinkable. He climbed back into the driver's seat, put the bus into gear, and steered it toward the wide trench dug out for the highway's foundation. The children screamed as they saw the earth open ahead, the black mud gleaming under the storm. The bus lurched forward, its tires sliding in the muck. The sound was deafening, the grind of metal, the shrieks of terrified voices, the roar of the storm outside. The bus plunged nose first into the pit. The children were thrown forward, colliding with seats, with each other. Water and mud splashed up against the windows, streaking them in black. Panic consumed the air. Some clawed at the windows. Others tried to force open the rear door, their cries echoing like a chorus of despair. Harold sat at the wheel, breathing hard, his face blank, as though his body moved on its own. He didn't flinch at the chaos behind him. To him, this was destiny, the inevitable end of a life spent invisible. In the final moments, time fractured. Some children called for their mothers. Some screamed until their voices broke, and some fell into stunned silence, frozen by terror. Anna's eyes locked on Harold through the mirror, her face pale and wet with tears. For a brief second, Harold faltered. Doubt flickered. What had he done? But the doubt was swallowed by the weight of his madness, his need to finish what he had started. The mud swallowed the bus slowly, dragging it down as the storm raged above. The sound of metal groaning filled the air, the windows shattering under the pressure of the earth. The children's cries grew muffled, their fists pounding weaker against the glass. Within minutes, the bus was no longer visible, buried beneath soil and rain. The clearing fell silent, save for the storm's endless drumming. Harold climbed out through the driver's side window, his clothes soaked, his body trembling. He stood in the rain, staring at the mound of earth that now concealed the bus. His face was unreadable, caught somewhere between relief and horror. His hands shook violently, but he made no move to uncover what he had done. Instead, he turned away, his footsteps heavy in the mud, leaving behind the secret that would stay buried for 35 years. In the immediate aftermath, the woods seemed unnaturally quiet. No more screams, no sound of life inside the earth. Just rain, and Harold's ragged breathing. His mind wavered between panic and denial, but he told himself over and over, they were free now. The town would never hurt him again. The weight of what he had done pressed on him, yet at the same time, he felt a strange calm. He had crossed a line from which he could never return, and the silence of the clearing was his only witness. When he finally walked away, leaving the bus entombed beneath the highway construction site, the storm began to ease. The clouds parted faintly, a weak light slipping through, as if mocking what had just taken place. The town would soon begin to wonder where their children had gone. Mothers would pace doorsteps, fathers would make phone calls, police would launch frantic searches. But in that moment, in those woods, the truth was hidden beneath layers of earth and rain, sealed by the silence of a man who had chosen to become their nightmare. The first hours after the bus failed to arrive at school were filled with confusion more than fear. Teachers checked their watches, assuming a delay from the weather. Parents called the school, asking if schedules had changed. The secretary flipped through lists, uncertain whether she had misplaced something. At first, no one thought the unthinkable. It was only a bus, after all, only a slight delay. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the realization began to spread like a slow poison. 20 children and their driver had vanished without a trace. Mothers paced kitchens with phones clutched in trembling hands, calling neighbors, checking if their child had perhaps stayed home with a friend. Fathers left their jobs early, stomping through front doors with questions that had no answers. The school itself fell into chaos, teachers trying to keep other students calm, the principal calling law enforcement, his own hands shaking as he scribbled notes that meant nothing. Within hours, the small town that had once lived on routine and quiet order descended into panic. The police set up checkpoints, combed through maps, and questioned witnesses. But the rain had washed away tire tracks, leaving little more than mud and shadows. Officers drove along country roads, peering into ditches, their sirens echoing in the gray afternoon. Helicopters circled overhead. Families gathered outside the school, clinging to one another, eyes darting toward the horizon as if the bus might appear at any moment. But it never did. For the parents, grief came first in waves of denial. Mrs. Callahan, whose son Thomas had been on the bus, insisted her husband's influence would fix everything, that somehow the bus had broken down and would be found within the hour. Anna's mother sat on the school steps, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers under her breath. Peter's father, drunk by evening, shouted at police officers, demanding answers they didn't have. The town buzzed with theories: an accident on the road, a kidnapping, even whispers of something darker. Every explanation fell short against the hollow silence that had replaced the laughter of 20 children. Harold Pierce returned home that night, soaked and trembling. He stripped off his wet clothes and sat in the dark of his kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. He did not cry, nor did he rejoice. He simply sat, staring at his hands, as though trying to convince himself they were clean. In his mind, he repeated the story he had chosen to believe. He had saved them, given them peace from a world that would only break them. But the silence pressed too hard, and sometimes he heard their screams echoing in his ears, sharper at night when the world was quiet. He told himself it was only memory, not guilt. Yet he could not sleep. He lit cigarette after cigarette, the smoke curling in the stale air, and waited for morning. The community fractured quickly under the weight of the loss. Neighbors who had once waved across fences now eyed one another with suspicion. Rumors spread accusations against strangers, whispers about parents with enemies, speculation about cults or revenge. The Callahans used their wealth to dominate the media narrative, ensuring that their son's name appeared in every headline, his photo on every flyer. Other families grew resentful, feeling their children were being erased in the shadow of the Callahans' influence. Friendships that had lasted decades crumbled under jealousy, blame, and the unbearable pressure of grief. In churches, pastors preached about faith and endurance, but the pews were filled with hollow faces, parents who had no comfort left in Scripture. In bars, men drank deeper, their sorrow spilling into angry words and fistfights. The local paper published daily updates, but with no evidence and no suspects, the story turned into speculation. Some townsfolk believed the bus had been hijacked. Others believed the children had run away. A few whispered about the driver, Harold, though no one could prove anything. He had been invisible for so long that it was easier to forget him than to accuse him. The children's bedrooms became shrines. Beds left unmade from that morning, toys still scattered on floors, clothes folded neatly in drawers waiting to be worn again. Parents refused to change anything, as if leaving the rooms untouched would allow their children to walk back in one day. Photographs were clutched until they bent. Voices cracked as mothers called their children's names into empty spaces. Some marriages collapsed under the strain. Husbands blamed wives for not driving their children that morning. Wives accused husbands of failing to protect them. Divorce papers were filed quietly, shame mixing with despair. Harold himself became a ghost within the town. He went to work for a short time after, but the stares were unbearable. Parents demanded answers from him, though his expression remained blank. Eventually, the school board dismissed him, citing the strain of the investigation. Alone in his house, Harold's mind wavered between pride and torment. He clipped newspaper articles, saving every story about the missing bus. He read them over and over, telling himself the silence in the earth was proof of his power. Yet each night, when the house was dark, the guilt pressed harder. He drank until his stomach burned, trying to drown out the sound of fists pounding against glass that only he remembered. As weeks turned into months, hope dwindled. Candlelight vigils turned smaller, posters faded in the rain, and police resources shifted toward other cases. For some parents, denial hardened into obsession. They refused to accept their children were gone, joining search parties in nearby woods, chasing false leads across state lines. For others, grief settled into silence. They stopped speaking of their children, as though saying their names made the loss unbearable. The town itself felt emptier, quieter, the laughter of children replaced by whispers of tragedy. The media painted the town as cursed, a place of sorrow and unanswered questions. Reporters swarmed for interviews, flashing cameras in parents' faces, digging into private lives. Old secrets were dragged into the open affairs. Debts, petty rivalries, each printed as though it were connected to the crime. Families already broken by grief found themselves exposed to public judgment. Some were pitied, others mocked. The Callahans in particular drew fire for their arrogance, their insistence on controlling the narrative. Where once their wealth had made them untouchable, now it made them despised. For the children's friends who had been spared by chance, those who had taken the day off school, or who lived just outside the route, survivors' guilt cut deep. They avoided the bus stops, avoided each other's eyes, their innocence shattered. Nightmares plagued them, visions of the bus sinking into darkness, though they had never seen it happen. Teachers noticed the changes, sudden anger, withdrawal, grades slipping, but there was little they could do. Trauma had spread through the classrooms like a stain, and no lesson plan could erase it. Harold aged quickly in the years that followed. His hair thinned, his skin grew sallow, and his silence deepened. People who once ignored him now eyed him with suspicion, though no one dared confront him directly. He lived on the outskirts of town, his curtains always drawn, his yard overgrown. Some children whispered that his house was haunted, that you could hear cries if you walked past at night. But the police never searched, never dug beneath the highway where the bus lay buried. For 35 years, his secret remained untouched. The crime changed everything. The town that had once felt safe and predictable became a place defined by loss. Parents no longer trusted bus routes, schools installed stricter security, and children grew up faster, their innocence stolen by a mystery that was never solved. Every year, on the anniversary, the families gathered for a memorial, their faces older, their grief no less sharp. Some still held on to hope, others clung only to each other. But the shadow of the missing bus stretched over them all, a reminder of how fragile life had been, how quickly it could be swallowed whole. And for Harold, every passing year was a sentence. Though no handcuffs ever touched his wrists, his prison was the silence of his own mind. He carried the screams with him, the faces pressed against glass, the prayers whispered into the air. He told himself they were free, but the weight never lifted. His crime had bound him to them forever, even as the earth kept its silence. When the highway was finally expanded 35 years later, the earth gave up its secret. Construction workers unearthed the rusted shell of the school bus, buried deep beneath layers of soil and asphalt. Inside were the remnants of 20 small lives, and the echoes of a story the town had tried to bury with silence. The discovery hit like a second tragedy, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. Parents, now gray-haired or gone, were forced to relive the morning their children vanished. Those who had once clung to denial were left with the harsh truth. Those who had accepted loss now faced the horror of how it had really ended. The authorities launched a new investigation, though time had already erased much of what could have been proven. Harold Pierce was an old man now, frail and quiet, his face a hollow shadow of the man he once was. He was arrested. The image of him in handcuffs splashed across television screens, his name etched forever into the nation's memory. The trial became more than just a pursuit of justice. It was a reckoning, not only for Harold but for the town that had ignored its own cracks for so long. In the courtroom, survivors' families filled the benches, their eyes fixed on Harold with a mixture of hatred, grief, and exhaustion. Some shouted at him, demanding answers he could not give. Others sat in silence, clutching photographs of children frozen in time. Harold himself said little. When pressed, he muttered about saving the children, about freeing them from the cruelty of the world, but his words rang hollow against the weight of what had been uncovered. The jury took little time to deliver a guilty verdict, though the sentence felt both too late and too small compared to the magnitude of the crime. Justice in the end was partial. Harold was locked away, but the families were left with lives permanently broken. Some took comfort in the conviction, believing at last that the truth had been spoken aloud. Others felt no relief, no punishment could bring back what had been lost. The town, once defined by its silence, now carried the stain of being the place where 20 children had vanished beneath a road. For decades it had been a rumor, a ghost story, but now it was history, carved into stone. The societal impact was enormous. Laws surrounding school transport were tightened, with stricter background checks and surveillance. Communities across the country reevaluated how much trust they placed in the seemingly ordinary people who held responsibility for their children. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring quiet desperation, about how bitterness and loneliness could rot into something monstrous if left unchecked. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths, that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, blending into the everyday until it is too late. For the families, the discovery redefined their lives once again. Some parents passed away before ever learning the truth, their graves now marked by both sorrow and closure. The surviving siblings of the victims carried the shadow of their brothers and sisters into adulthood, shaping careers, marriages, and identities around the tragedy. Many of them described their childhood as stolen, replaced with funerals, media swarms, and unanswered questions. Even after Harold's conviction, their wounds remained raw, proof that justice and healing are not the same thing. The public reaction was equally conflicted. Some saw Harold as a monster, a man who had orchestrated an unspeakable crime and hidden it beneath their feet. Others, disturbingly, saw him as a product of his environment, a man twisted by poverty, ridicule, and decades of being overlooked. This sparked debate about whether society itself had failed, whether the seeds of horror had been planted long before Harold ever acted. Scholars, journalists, and psychologists dissected the case, writing about power, alienation, and the fragile balance between belonging and isolation. At its core, the story became less about one man's madness and more about what it revealed of human nature. Harold had been invisible, yet his rage had the power to alter hundreds of lives. The wealth of the Callahans could not shield them from grief. The silence of the community, their refusal to see the signs, became a form of complicity, and the children innocent, carrying the burdens of their parents' failures, became symbols of what is lost when society turns away from its own cracks. The morality of it all resisted easy answers. Was Harold evil, or was he broken? Did the town deserve its suffering, or was it simply a victim of one man's sickness? The answers were blurred, as they so often are in life. What was clear, though, was that power, whether the power of wealth, of silence, or of one desperate man, shaped every part of the tragedy. It showed how thin the line is between order and chaos, how quickly trust can turn to betrayal, how fragile the bonds of community truly are. In the end, the conclusion was not clean. The court case closed. The bus was removed. The highway rebuilt. Families carried on, though never the same. The world moved forward. But in that town, time remained divided into before and after. The story stood as a warning that evil can hide in plain sight, that loneliness can fester into destruction, and that silence, societal, communal, or personal, can be as deadly as any weapon. Justice was served in name, but the greater justice, the return of lives, the healing of families, the restoration of innocence, was impossible. What remained was reflection, the sobering realization that tragedies like these are not just about individuals but about the systems, relationships, and failings that surround them. The bus beneath the highway was a grave not only for the children but for the illusion that their world had ever been safe.